Lieutenant Thomas Kerr had been at the forward observation post for 17 minutes when he noticed the previous intelligence officer's wristwatch still ticking on the makeshift desk, its leather band dark with something that might have been mud. Nobody would tell him where Lieutenant Pembridge had gone, only that he'd last been seen 3 nights ago walking toward the tree line with a wire recorder and a notebook. If this topic resonates with you, subscribe and support the episode. The post sat 200 yards behind the main defensive line near Aitape, close enough to hear the mortars when they came in, far enough that Divisional Command felt comfortable sending staff officers there to pretend they were doing frontline work. Kerr wasn't a staff officer. He'd been pulled from Signals Intelligence in Brisbane, given a revolver he'd never fired, and flown to New Guinea on a transport that smelled like aviation fuel and vomit. His orders were typed on a half sheet of paper. Report to Captain Milligan, Aitape Forward Zone, Special Assignment. The words _quote_0_ had been underlined twice. Captain Milligan turned out to be a sunburned man from Adelaide who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He met Kerr at the airstrip, barely glanced at his papers, and drove him to the observation post in a jeep that bottomed out on every rut. They didn't speak until they reached the post itself, a sandbagged position surrounded by cassowary plum trees and wait-a-while vines that grabbed at your sleeves if you brushed against them. Milligan pointed to a tent, a foxhole, and a field telephone connected to a wire that disappeared into the jungle canopy. Then he pointed to the wire recorder bolted to an ammunition crate. Quote 1, Milligan said. Quote 2. Kerr had a dozen questions, but Milligan was already walking back to the jeep. Quote 3, he called over his shoulder. Quote 4. Kerr spent the first day examining the equipment. The wire recorder was an American model, heavy as a mortar shell, with 2 spools and a microphone that picked up every insect buzz within 20 feet. Pembridge had left 3 boxes of recorded wire, neatly labeled by date and time. Kerr threaded one onto the playback spindle and listened through headphones that made his ears sweat. For 10 minutes he heard only jungle, cicadas, frogs, something that might have been a bird or might have been a dying man, he couldn't tell. Then, abruptly, silence. Not complete silence, but a sudden drop, as if someone had turned down the volume on the entire forest. It lasted maybe a minute. Then the insects came back, cautious at first, then building to their previous density. He played another recording, same thing. 40 minutes of noise, then a pause, then resumption. He checked the 3rd spool. The pattern repeated, but the timing was different, sometimes 20 minutes between silences, sometimes an hour. Pembridge had made notes in the margins of a ledger book. Silence 0214, duration 58 seconds. Silence 0309, duration 42 seconds. The handwriting got smaller and tighter as the pages progressed, until the final entry was barely legible. They know we're listening. That night, Kerr sat in the sandbagged position with the recorder running and his service revolver on his lap. He'd never been comfortable with weapons. In Brisbane, he'd worked with cipher clerks and radio operators, men who fought the war with pencils and code books. Now he was 200 yards from an enemy that sent patrols through the jungle at night, and his only defence was 6 rounds and the hope that someone would hear him if he screamed into the field telephone. The insects started their evening chorus around 1830, a rising wall of sound that made conversation impossible. Kerr put on the headphones and listened to the microphone feed. Through the amplification, the jungle became a layered thing. High-pitched whines, low thrumming pulses, clicks that sounded almost mechanical. At 21:43, everything stopped. Not gradually, but all at once, as if a switch had been thrown. Kerr's hand went to the revolver. He counted seconds in his head, forcing himself to breathe slowly. At 71 seconds, the insects resumed. He marked the time in Pembridge's ledger, his hand shaking enough that the numbers came out crooked. 20 minutes later, it happened again. This time, he noticed something else. The silence didn't spread from a single point. It moved, starting from his left and rolling toward the right, following the tree line like a wave. The infantry dismissed it as nerves. Kerr spent the second morning walking the perimeter, asking questions that made the riflemen look at him like he'd gone tropo. A corporal from Townsville, face scarred from coral cuts that hadn't healed properly, finally told him what he wanted to know. Quote, 8. But when Kerr pressed him about timing, whether the silences came regularly, the corporal's expression changed. "You sound like Pembridge," he said, and walked away. Kerr found the runner at 0600 the next morning, a private named Davies, who couldn't have been older than 19. Davies delivered rations and collected the previous night's wire spools without making eye contact. When Kerr asked about Pembridge, Davies stopped moving. "He started talking about patterns," the private said quietly. "Said the jungle was on a schedule. Captain Milligan told him to take a few days' rest, but Pembridge said he couldn't stop listening because he was close to something. Then one night he packed up the recorder, said he needed to get closer to the source, and walked into the trees. We found the recorder 2 days later, smashed up near a creek bed. No sign of him." The recordings became an obsession. Kerr rigged up a second listening position 50 yards south, using a spare microphone and running wire back to the main post. He couldn't cover much ground, but he could create a baseline comparison. If the silences were caused by local disturbances, an animal, a falling branch, they wouldn't synchronize across both positions. That night, he wore both sets of headphones, one ear on each feed, and waited. At 22:07, both microphones went silent within 3 seconds of each other. The pause lasted 91 seconds. When the insects returned, they came back on the southern position first, then the northern one, a gap of maybe 5 seconds between them. He started mapping the silences on graph paper, using a coordinate system based on his 2 microphone positions. Each silence got marked with a timestamp and duration. After 3 nights, he had 17 data points. They formed a pattern, but not one he understood. Some silences were brief, under a minute. Others stretched past 2 minutes. The intervals between them varied wildly, sometimes 8 minutes, sometimes 90. But there was something underneath the chaos, a structure he couldn't quite perceive, like looking at camouflage and knowing something was hidden in it, but unable to see what. On the 4th night, a signals corporal named Webb showed up at the post with a thermos of tea that tasted like boiled dirt and cigarette ash. Webb had been in New Guinea since '42, back when the fighting was at Kokoda, and he had the kind of exhausted competence that came from staying alive longer than most. He sat in the sandbagged position without asking permission and listened to the jungle for 20 minutes. When the first silence came, he didn't react. When the second one hit, 14 minutes later, he checked his watch and nodded. "They're running patrols," Webb said. "Japs move through here on a rotation. Been doing it for weeks. Always at night, always quiet, always gone by morning." Kerr showed him the graph paper covered in timestamps. Webb studied it with the kind of focus usually reserved for diffusing unexploded ordnance. "You're timing the gaps," he said. It wasn't a question. But Webb didn't sound convinced by his own words. He tapped the paper where Kerr had circled a cluster of silences that occurred 22 minutes apart. "This is too regular," Webb said. "Animals don't move on a clock." Kerr asked if anyone had tried correlating the silences with actual enemy sightings. Webb laughed, a sound without humor. "Sightings? Mate, we barely see them. They move through here like ghosts. Sometimes we find tracks in the morning, sometimes we don't. The only way we know they're out there is when someone doesn't come back from a patrol, or when a listening post stops reporting." He poured more tea from the thermos, hands steady despite what he was saying. "But yeah, Pembridge tried. He convinced a lieutenant to log every contact, every sound, every smell of tobacco smoke that might mean Japs were close. Compared it to his recordings. That's when he started saying he'd found something. Week later, he was gone." The silence came again at 01:33, longer this time, stretching past 2.5 minutes. In the darkness beyond the wire, Kerr heard something else underneath the absence of insects. A sound so faint he thought he might be imagining it. A metallic click, like a canteen cap being fastened, or a rifle bolt moving into position. Webb heard it too. He didn't reach for his weapon, didn't move at all, just sat perfectly still until the insects came back. When they did, he stood up slowly and looked at Kerr with an expression that might have been pity or respect or both. "Keep recording," he said. But don't go looking for the source. Pembridge did, and the jungle kept him. After Webb left, Kerr played back the wire from that silence. The metallic sound was there, captured at 01:34 and 18 seconds. He rewound and played it 6 times, trying to identify it. Not a natural sound, not an animal, something manufactured, something carried by a human being moving carefully through the dark. By the 5th night, Kerr had filled 4 pages of Pembridge's ledger with timestamps arranged in columns. He'd stopped trying to find meaning in individual silences and started looking at the intervals between them. 22 minutes, then 38, then 22 again. The pattern repeated 3 times over 2 nights before dissolving into what looked like randomness. Then, 6 hours later, it started again. 22, 38, 22. He sat in the sandbagged position at 0300, staring at numbers by flashlight, wondering if exhaustion was making him see structure where none existed. The cryptanalyst arrived without warning on the 6th morning. No name, no rank insignia visible on his uniform, just a captain's pips that looked recently sewn on. He appeared while Kerr was eating tinned peaches for breakfast, accompanied by Captain Milligan, who looked even more exhausted than usual. Quote, 22, Milligan said, the words clipped. Quote, 23. Shaw didn't offer a handshake. He went directly to the ammunition crate where the wire spools were stored, kneeled down, and started reading the labels. Shaw worked in silence for 2 hours, threading spools onto the recorder and listening through headphones while making notations in a pocket notebook. He barely moved, just sat cross-legged in the dirt with his eyes closed, occasionally rewinding sections and playing them again. Kerr watched from the foxhole, feeling like an intruder in his own post. When Shaw finally removed the headphones, his face was unreadable. "The intervals," he said. "Show me your timing data." Kerr handed over the ledger. Shaw read it standing up, flipping pages faster than seemed possible for genuine comprehension. "Where did you study mathematics?" Shaw asked. Kerr blinked. "I didn't. I was a radio operator before they sent me here." Shaw looked up from the ledger, something like surprise crossing his features. "You found this pattern without training?" He tapped the page where Kerr had circled the 22, 38, 22 sequence. "This is a rotating interval. Military patrols use them when they're trying to avoid predictability, but need to maintain coverage of multiple routes. The Japanese learned it from the Germans. You're looking at a schedule." Shaw requisitioned everything: the wire spools, the ledger, even Pembridge's wristwatch, which Kerr had kept on the desk like some kind of talisman. He packed it all into a canvas bag that he sealed with wire and a lead stamp. Shaw said. Kerr asked what he'd found. Shaw looked at him for a long moment, then said something that made no sense. "The insects aren't the message. They're the paper it's written on." Then he was gone, walking back toward the main line with the bag over his shoulder, leaving Kerr standing in the morning heat with no explanation. But Kerr couldn't stop listening. That night he sat in the position without the recorder running, just his own ears and his wristwatch. The first silence came at 21:19. He marked the time on his forearm with a pencil. 22 minutes later, another silence. Then 38 minutes. Then 22. The pattern held. Whatever Shaw had seen, whatever Pembridge had discovered before he disappeared, it was real. The jungle was operating on a timetable. The orders arrived 31 hours later, delivered by Davies, who looked nervous enough to bolt. Kerr was being reassigned to a new posting, coordinates provided on a separate sheet. He was to bring his personal kit, his weapon, and nothing else. Report time, 1800 hours today. The orders were signed by someone in divisional intelligence whose name Kerr didn't recognize. There was a second sheet, handwritten, that Davies gave him separately. "Captain Shaw said to give you this after you read the official orders." The note was brief. "Bring your watch. You'll need it." The new posting turned out to be a commandeered plantation house 7 miles west of Itape, far enough from the front that you couldn't hear the artillery, but close enough that the air still smelled like smoke and rot. Shaw met him at the entrance, now wearing major's insignia. "How long did it take you to notice the promotion was wrong?" Shaw asked. Kerr admitted he'd assumed signals intelligence operated under different protocols. Shaw smiled without warmth. quote 36. He led Kerr through rooms filled with maps, radio equipment, and 3 other men who looked up briefly, then returned to their work. The back room contained something Kerr hadn't expected. A wall covered in graph paper, floor to ceiling, marked with colored pencils in a pattern that looked like a demented musical score. Shaw stood in front of it like a conductor facing an orchestra. "Pembridge started this," he said. "He mapped 8 nights of silences before he disappeared. I've added 17 more nights from other listening posts along the coast. What you found at your position is happening everywhere. The Japanese are running coordinated patrols across a 12-mile front, and they're doing it on a schedule so precise you could set your watch by it." Kerr studied the wall. The colored lines represented different listening posts, each one showing the same rotating pattern of intervals. But there were gaps, places where the data didn't line up, where silences occurred at unexpected times or lasted longer than they should. Shaw saw him looking. "Quote 39, he said. Quote 40. Shaw turned away from the wall. Quote 41. He paused. Quote 42. Kerr looked at the graph paper wall, at the patterns that seemed too perfect to be accidental, and felt something cold settle in his stomach. If Shaw was right, if the timing was that precise, it meant the enemy was organized to a degree that contradicted everything he'd been told about jungle warfare. It meant someone on the other side was running this like a railroad schedule. Shaw's recruitment criteria made no sense until Kerr watched him interview the first candidate. A private from Sydney named Morton, who'd worked as a piano tuner before the war, sitting across from Shaw in the plantation house while rain hammered the tin roof. Shaw didn't ask about combat experience or jungle survival. He played a recording of insect noise for 30 seconds, stopped it, then asked Morton to hum back what he'd heard. Morton closed his eyes and reproduced not the overall sound, but individual layers within it. A high whine, a clicking rhythm, a pulsing drone. Shaw hired him immediately. Over 6 days they assembled 11 men, a cellist from Melbourne, 2 brothers who'd sung in church choirs in Brisbane, a clockmaker from Adelaide who could tell time by the angle of shadows, a schoolteacher from Perth who taught music to children with hearing difficulties and could distinguish pitch variations of less than a semitone. Shaw didn't want soldiers who could shoot straight. He wanted men who could hear the architecture of sound, who understood that noise had structure and that structure could be measured. Kerr watched them arrive one by one at the plantation house, confused and wary, none of them understanding what they'd been recruited for. The training took place in the back room with the graph paper wall. Shaw made them listen to recordings of jungle silence, not the insect noise, but the pauses between them. "Focus on what's not there," he said. "The absence has a shape. It has duration, intensity, boundaries. When insects stop making noise, they're responding to something. Your job is to measure that response with enough precision that we can use it." He played a recording where the silence rolled from left to right across the microphone array. "That's movement," Shaw said, "something traveling parallel to our line. Speed determines how fast the silence propagates. Direction determines which microphone goes quiet first." They practiced with wire recorders and stopwatches, learning to mark timestamps within a half-second accuracy. Shaw was merciless about precision. When the cellist from Melbourne recorded a silence starting at 22, 14, and 30 seconds, Shaw made him listen 5 more times until he corrected it to 22, 14, and 27 seconds. 3 seconds doesn't matter in music, Shaw said. In this work, 3 seconds is the difference between an empty trail and an ambush. The men didn't complain. They'd all seen enough death to understand that precision might be the only thing keeping them alive. The listening posts went up at night. Combat engineers strung wire through the canopy while infantry provided security, everyone working in silence with taped-down equipment that wouldn't rattle or reflect moonlight. Each post consisted of 2 microphones positioned 40 yards apart, connected by field telephone to a recording station dug into a concealed position. Kerr watched the network take shape across a topographical map in the plantation house, 12 points of observation covering the approaches to Aitape, each one manned by 2 of Shaw's recruits, with orders to log every silence, every anomaly, every deviation from the expected pattern of jungle noise. The data started flowing in on the third night. The schoolteacher from Perth, stationed at Post 7 near a creek crossing, reported silences at 21:41, 22:03, and 22:41. The timing matched Shaw's predictions within 90 seconds. Post 3, positioned near a ridgeline, recorded a propagating silence that moved south to north over a span of 4 minutes, something large or numerous passing through. Post 9 caught nothing, just uninterrupted insect chorus until 0300, which Shaw marked on his war chart as a gap in the patrol route. By the fourth night, patterns emerged across all 12 posts, a latticework of predictable silences that revealed patrol routes like invisible paths drawn through the jungle. But the work destroyed men faster than combat did. The clockmaker from Adelaide lasted 6 nights before requesting transfer back to regular infantry. He told Kerr the listening made him feel like he was drowning in information, like every sound meant something, and he couldn't stop trying to interpret it all. One of the choir singers from Brisbane developed a twitch, his head cocking to the left every few seconds, as if hearing something no one else could. Shaw pulled him from duty, but kept him at the plantation house, unwilling to let anyone who understood the system leave the operational area. The mathematician arrived on the 8th day. Captain Raymond Shaw, no relation to the intelligence officer, which led to immediate confusion, came from Melbourne with 2 footlockers full of textbooks, slide rules, and notebooks filled with equations that looked like hieroglyphics to Kerr. Raymond Shaw was older, maybe 40, with glasses held together by tape and the kind of methodical mannerisms that suggested he'd spent the war safely behind a desk until someone decided his skills were needed elsewhere. He set up in the front room of the plantation house, covering a table with graph paper and mechanical pencils, and asked for all the raw data from every listening post. For 3 days, Raymond Shaw barely spoke. He worked through the data with a slide rule, making calculations that filled page after page with numbers and symbols. Kerr watched him reduce 17 nights of observations into a series of equations that allegedly described the enemy patrol schedule. The mathematics made no sense to Kerr. Differential equations, probability distributions, something Raymond called, quote, 49. But the mathematician seemed satisfied. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, he called both Shaw's and Kerr together and showed them a chart covered in predicted patrol times for the next week. Raymond said, tapping the chart, quote, 51. He adjusted his taped glasses. Quote, 52. Intelligence, Shaw, the one who'd recruited Kerr, studied the predictions with an expression Kerr couldn't read. Raymond nodded. Intelligence, Shaw looked at Kerr. He turned back to the wall of graph paper. That night, at Post 4, near a ravine that cut through the patrol routes, the schoolteacher from Perth recorded a silence at exactly 22:14, within 30 seconds of Raymond Shaw's mathematical prediction. The silence propagated northeast at a walking pace for 3 minutes and 17 seconds, suggesting a patrol of approximately 12 to 15 men moving in single file. No one at Post 4 saw anything. No one heard footsteps or voices. Just the insects going quiet, then resuming, marking the passage of an enemy that moved through the dark with the precision of clockwork. Command didn't believe them. Intelligent Shaw made the case to a colonel from divisional headquarters who listened with the kind of polite skepticism usually reserved for soldiers claiming they'd seen ghosts. The colonel examined Raymond Shaw's equations, asked 3 questions about sample size and statistical confidence, then said what everyone in the room already knew he'd say. Predictions weren't intelligence, and intelligence without confirmation was speculation. He wanted proof. Not recordings of silent insects, not mathematical models, but visual confirmation that Japanese patrols were where the mathematics said they'd be. Intelligent Shaw came back to the plantation house looking like he'd aged a year in an afternoon. Quote 57, he told Kerr and Raymond. Quote 58. Raymond recalculated his predictions, factoring in weather data and recent pattern deviations. He settled on a ravine 3 miles northwest of Post 4, predicting a patrol would pass through at 02:37 on the morning of September 9th. Margin of error, plus or minus 90 seconds. The reconnaissance team consisted of 6 men, 4 infantry with jungle experience, Kerr because he understood the timing system, and Webb, the signals corporal, who'd been the first to take Kerr's observations seriously. They moved out at 2200 on the 8th, travelling light with weapons, water, and watches synchronized to the second against Raymond's calculations. Webb led them through terrain so thick the moonlight barely reached the ground, following trails that weren't really trails, just slightly less dense corridors through the WWII vines and lawyer cane that could strip skin off your arms if you weren't careful. They reached the ravine at 0143 and settled into positions on the north slope, where the undergrowth provided concealment. Webb positioned them in pairs, 20 yards apart, with strict instructions: no movement, no sound, no smoking. If the patrol came through, they'd count the enemy soldiers, note their equipment and direction, and withdraw without engagement. If nothing happened, they'd wait until 0400, then extract. Kerr checked his watch every 2 minutes, unable to help himself. The mathematics said 0237. Either Raymond was right or they were sitting in the dark for nothing. The insects went silent at 0234. Not the usual gradual decrease that preceded a large animal moving through, but an immediate shutdown, as if someone had cut power to the jungle. Kerr felt his heartbeat in his throat. 60 yards down the ravine, barely visible in the darkness, a shape moved. Then another. Then a line of them, single file, maintaining interval spacing that looked almost mechanical in its precision. Kerr counted 12 figures. They carried rifles at port arms, moved without talking, and crossed the ravine floor in under 4 minutes. The last man in the column paused at the far edge, turning back to scan their back trail, and Kerr saw something that made his mouth go dry. The Japanese soldier was checking a wristwatch. The insects resumed at 0241, 2 minutes after the last enemy soldier disappeared into the jungle. Webb made a hand signal, and they withdrew in reverse order, moving slowly until they were half a mile from the ravine, then faster until they reached the extraction point, where a runner waited with a field telephone connection to the plantation house. Webb called it in while Kerr sat against a tree, hands shaking from adrenaline, and something else, a feeling he couldn't name. They'd just watched mathematics predict human behavior with a precision that shouldn't have been possible. The enemy wasn't sloppy or unpredictable. They were running a system, and Raymond Shaw had cracked it. Command's skepticism evaporated. Within 72 hours, intelligence officers Kerr had never seen before descended on the plantation house, reviewing the data and Raymond's calculations with an intensity that suggested careers were now attached to this information. Maps appeared showing every predicted patrol route across the Aitape sector. Raymond refined his equations, incorporating data from additional listening posts that were hastily established up and down the coast. The network expanded to 23 observation points, then 31, each one manned by men selected for their ability to distinguish and measure the silences that marked enemy movement. But the success created a new problem that Shaw raised during a briefing on the 5th day after the ravine observation. "We're collecting intelligence faster than we can exploit it," he said, standing before a wall now covered with 3 weeks of patrol predictions. "We know where they'll be and when they'll be there. Command wants us to use that for ambushes, interdiction, all the standard tactical applications." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But if we start acting on every prediction, the enemy will notice. They'll realize we're anticipating their movements. They'll change the schedule and we'll lose everything we've built." The room went quiet. Kerr understood the implication immediately. They'd discovered something so valuable that using it might destroy it. Raymond adjusted his glasses. An unconscious gesture Kerr had learned meant the mathematician was working through probability calculations in his head. "Quote 62, Raymond said. Quote 63, intelligence." Shaw nodded, but Kerr could see he disagreed with something about the approach. Quote 64. He looked at the wall of predictions. Quote 65. That night, at Post 14 near a coastal track, the listeners recorded something that didn't fit the pattern. a silence that started at 0117, lasted 7 minutes, and propagated in the wrong direction, south to north, instead of the predicted north to south. The listeners reported it immediately. Raymond spent an hour checking his calculations, then rechecking them, before admitting he had no explanation. Either his mathematics were wrong, which seemed unlikely given the ravine observation, or the Japanese had just done something unpredictable. Webb, who'd been monitoring the radio reports, said what everyone was thinking. Quote 66. Intelligence. Shaw asked if that meant the system was compromised. Webb shrugged. Quote 67. Kerr walked outside, needing air that didn't smell like paper and pencil lead. The plantation house sat on a small hill, and from the veranda he could see the jungle stretching toward the coast, dark and dense and full of hidden mathematics. Somewhere out there, an enemy intelligence officer might be sitting in his own command post, studying his own graphs, wondering if the Australians had noticed the test he'd just run. Two groups of men, listening to the same jungle, hearing different messages in the same silences. Raymond's calculations stopped making sense on the morning of September 16th. Not all of them, just specific routes. Post 7 and Post 19 both recorded silences that violated the predicted schedule by more than 12 minutes. Raymond spent 6 hours rechecking his mathematics, verifying that he hadn't made transcription errors, then finally admitted what the numbers were telling him. Quote, 68, he said, pointing to the aberrations on his charts. Quote, 69. Intelligence Shaw understood immediately what that meant. Quote, 70. He looked at Kerr. Quote, 71. Raymond tapped his pencil against the chart. Quote, 72. The answer came faster than anyone expected. By the evening of the 17th, 6 more routes had shifted their timing. Raymond mapped the changes and found something that made him call an immediate meeting. Quote, 73, he said, showing them a revised chart where the new timings created a different pattern of overlapping coverage. Quote 74. Intelligence. Shaw studied the changes with an expression that suggested he was seeing something nobody else had noticed yet. Quote 75. Shaw said. Quote 76. He turned to the radio operator. Quote 77. The response came back within an hour. Multiple sectors were reporting increased Japanese patrol activity, tighter schedules, more aggressive reconnaissance. Something was building, but nobody knew what. Command decided to use the system. The target was a trail junction where 3 predicted patrol routes intersected, creating a 30-minute window each night when multiple Japanese squads should be in the area. Intelligence, Shaw argued against it, saying an ambush there would be too obviously informed. But he was overruled. A platoon from the 25th Battalion drew the assignment, 32 men led by a lieutenant from Tasmania who listened to the briefing with increasing disbelief. Quote, 78. The lieutenant looked at Raymond like he was insane. Quote, 79. They set the ambush for the night of September 19th. Kerr went with them, not because he needed to, but because Intelligence Shaw said someone who understood the system should be present to verify the predictions or document their failure. The platoon moved into position at 21:30, establishing a kill zone with overlapping fields of fire covering a 100-yard stretch of trail. Kerr positioned himself with the lieutenant in the center, watch visible in the darkness, counting down minutes. At 22:38, the insects went silent. At 22:41, the first Japanese soldier appeared on the trail, moving in single file, exactly where Raymond said they'd be. The ambush was efficient and brutal. The platoon opened fire from 3 sides, catching the patrol in a crossfire that gave them no room to maneuver or return effective fire. It lasted less than 2 minutes. When the shooting stopped, 11 enemy soldiers were dead on the trail, and the platoon had taken no casualties. The lieutenant stood over the bodies with an expression somewhere between triumph and unease. That was murder, he said quietly. They never had a chance because we knew exactly when they'd be there. Kerr didn't respond. He was looking at one of the dead soldiers, at the wristwatch on the man's arm that showed 22:43, still ticking. Intelligence Shaw called it a success. Command wanted more. Within 48 hours, orders came down for 3 additional ambushes based on Raymond's predictions, each one targeting a different patrol route, each one scheduled for maximum effect. Raymond protested that concentrated exploitation would compromise the system, but nobody cared anymore. They had predictions that worked, and men were dying in the jungle every night without them. Why not use every advantage available? Shaw argued back, citing counterintelligence principles, but the orders stood. The ambushes would proceed as planned. Post 11 reported the anomaly on the night of September 21st. A silence that lasted 14 minutes, far longer than any patrol movement should take, followed by a resumption of insect noise that sounded wrong, too uniform, too consistent, lacking the gradual build-up that usually followed disturbances. The listeners, both church singers from Brisbane, noted it in their log as _quote_82_. But when Intelligence Shaw reviewed the recording, he heard what they'd missed. The insects were still there, but they were calling at slightly different pitches than before, as if something had disturbed not just their behavior, but their distribution in the area. Raymond ran the numbers and found more anomalies scattered across 5 different posts over the past 3 nights. Small things, silences that lasted 30 seconds longer than expected, pauses that occurred 7 minutes early, insect choruses that resumed with unusual speed or unusual hesitation. "Something's changed," Raymond said, staring at his charts with the expression of a man watching a beautiful equation collapse into chaos. "Either the environment has shifted, which doesn't happen this fast, or someone is deliberately creating false positives in our data." Webb, who'd been listening from the doorway, walked in and looked at the charts. Quote 85. The room went quiet. It was an absurd statement that somehow wasn't absurd at all. If the Japanese had discovered the listening posts, if they understood that the Australians were using insect silence to track patrols, they could theoretically manipulate the system, send men to trigger silences where no patrol would follow, create false patterns that would lead to wasted ambushes, or, worse, ambushes positioned in places where the enemy expected them. Intelligence Shaw ordered an immediate stand-down on all planned ambushes. He sent runners to every listening post with instructions to increase observation security and report any sign that their positions had been compromised. Then he sat down with Kerr and Raymond and asked the question that neither of them wanted to answer. If they know we're listening, how long have they known, and how much of our data has been deliberately fed to us? Raymond went through his calculations again, this time looking for mathematical signatures that might indicate false data. He worked through the night, checking probability distributions and variance patterns, and by dawn he had an answer that made everything worse. "I can't tell," Raymond said, his voice hollow from exhaustion or fear or both. "If they're sophisticated enough to manipulate the system, they're sophisticated enough to make the manipulation look natural. We could have been tracking real patrols for weeks and false patrols for days. Or it could be the opposite. The mathematics doesn't distinguish between authentic behavior and performance." He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "We've built a system that works perfectly until someone on the other side understands it. Then it becomes a weapon pointed at ourselves." The test was Intelligence Shaw's idea, and it was designed to answer a question that shouldn't have needed asking. Were they listening to the enemy, or was the enemy performing for them? Shaw selected Post 17, a listening station that had produced consistently reliable data for 3 weeks, and ordered the team there to relocate their microphones 200 yards west without logging the change. If the silences followed the microphones to their new location, the patrols were real. If the silences continued in the old location, someone was deliberately triggering them for the benefit of listeners who were supposed to be there. The relocation happened on the night of September 23rd. 2 men moved the equipment while a skeleton crew maintained the recording station, creating the illusion that normal operations continued. Kerr monitored both positions via field telephone, waiting for the predicted silence at 23:14. It came on schedule at the old location, a 2-minute pause in insect noise that propagated south to north, exactly matching the expected patrol route. The new microphone position, 200 yards away, recorded nothing but continuous insect chorus. No silence, No patrol signature. Just uninterrupted jungle noise that meant either the patrol had passed between the two positions, which was statistically unlikely, or the silence at the old location was artificial. Intelligence Shaw received the report at 0100 and spent the next hour chain-smoking American cigarettes that someone had traded for. "They know where Post 17 is," he said finally, "which means they probably know where most of them are. We've been running this operation for a month. That's enough time for competent reconnaissance to map our entire network." Raymond asked if that meant all the data was compromised. Shaw shook his head. "Some of it's real. The ambush on the 19th killed real soldiers. But we can't tell which data points represent actual patrols and which represent deception operations. We're deaf without knowing we're deaf." Command's response was predictable. Shut down the listening network, pull back the observers, treat the entire system as compromised. But Intelligence Shaw argued for something different, something that made Kerr realize how far into the mirror game they'd gone. "If they're manipulating our observations," Shaw said during a contentious briefing with divisional staff, "then they believe we're acting on those observations, which means they're predicting our responses based on the false data they're feeding us. We can exploit that. Give them what they expect, then do something they're not prepared for." The plan took shape over 2 days of arguments between intelligence staff and combat commanders who didn't trust anything involving mathematical predictions and insect noises. Raymond would continue producing patrol predictions based on the existing data, knowing that some percentage was false. Command would brief company commanders on those predictions, knowing the information might be compromised. But the actual operations would be planned using different intelligence: prisoner interrogations, aerial reconnaissance, standard patrol reports, and positioned away from the mathematically predicted routes. The listening posts would continue operating, but their data would be treated as counterintelligence, a way to understand what the enemy wanted them to believe, rather than what was actually happening. Kerr watched the system he'd helped build get inverted into something that felt less like intelligence work and more like gambling with incomplete information. The listeners at each post continued their recordings, not knowing that their data was now considered potentially hostile, deliberately corrupted by an enemy they'd never seen. Some of them started reporting psychological symptoms, paranoia about the accuracy of their observations, obsessive rechecking of timestamps, an inability to trust their own ears. The schoolteacher from Perth requested transfer after reporting that he could no longer distinguish between real silences and imagined ones, that every pause in insect noise now felt like a threat or a lie. The first operation under the new doctrine happened on September 28th. Raymond's predictions indicated a heavy patrol presence along a ridgeline north of Post 8, with multiple routes converging between 2,200 and 2,230. The official operations order positioned 2 platoons to interdict those predicted patrols. But the actual assault went in 3 miles east, targeting a supply route that aerial reconnaissance had identified and prisoner interrogations had confirmed. The ridgeline ambush was staffed by 4 men with good cover and orders to observe only, reporting if enemy forces actually appeared where the mathematics said they would. The ridgeline stayed empty all night. No patrols, no silences, no insect disruptions beyond what you'd expect from natural animal movement. The 4 observers reported continuous jungle noise with normal patterns, the baseline sound of a forest not being transited by human activity. Meanwhile, 3 miles east, the assault platoons hit a Japanese supply column carrying ammunition and medical supplies, inflicting casualties and capturing documents that intelligence staff spent the next week translating. Command declared it a success. Intelligence Shaw called it confirmation that they'd been successfully deceived about patrol locations for an unknown period. But Post 22 recorded something on the night of the 29th that didn't fit either interpretation. A silence that began at 02:17 and lasted 9 minutes, accompanied by sounds underneath the silence, mechanical noises, metal on metal, possibly equipment being moved or positions being prepared. The listeners, both combat engineers who'd been trained to identify construction sounds, reported it as enemy fortification activity with high confidence. Raymond's mathematics hadn't predicted anything in that area. The standard intelligence summaries showed no enemy presence. Aerial reconnaissance had photographed the location 4 days earlier and found nothing but jungle. Intelligence Shaw sent a patrol to investigate at first light. They found a hastily abandoned position. Foxholes dug in a defensive perimeter, cut vegetation still fresh, signs of at least a platoon-sized element that had occupied the area recently, then withdrawn. No equipment left behind, no documents, just the physical evidence that something had been there. The patrol commander, a sergeant from Broken Hill who'd been in New Guinea since '43, said the position looked wrong. Quote, 96, he told Kerr when they reviewed the photographs. Quote, 97, Webb had a different theory. Quote, 98, he looked at the photographs of the abandoned foxholes. Quote, 99, Intelligence Shaw ordered the listening network to continue operations, but changed the reporting protocol. Instead of consolidating all data at the plantation house, each post now reported directly to separate analysis teams who didn't communicate with each other. The idea was to see if different analysts would interpret the same data differently, providing some measure of ground truth through comparison. But Kerr thought it resembled something else, a system eating itself, fragmenting under the pressure of uncertainty until nobody knew what anyone else believed or why. Raymond stopped sleeping. Kerr found him in the front room at 0400 on October 2nd, surrounded by paper covered in equations that had been crossed out and rewritten so many times the pages looked like abstract art. I had a thought, Raymond said, without looking up. What if they're not better at this than we are? What if they're just as lost, making the same mistakes, seeing patterns that aren't there? What if both sides are fighting a war against ghosts we've created for each other? He finally looked at Kerr, and his eyes had the hollow quality of someone who'd stared too long into complexity without finding answers. Quote 102. The prisoner arrived on October 4th, carried on a stretcher by 2 medics who looked relieved to hand him over to intelligence staff. Japanese soldier, early 20s, gunshot wound to the leg from a skirmish near the coast. Stable enough to interrogate, but weak enough that he probably wouldn't try anything stupid. The interrogation happened in a tent behind the plantation house, conducted by a Nisei translator from Hawaii, who spoke Japanese with a politeness that seemed incongruous given the circumstances. Intelligence Shaw and Kerr sat outside, listening through the canvas while the translator worked through the standard questions: name, unit, commanding officer, mission orders. The prisoner gave minimal answers until the translator asked about patrol schedules. Then, something changed in his tone, a shift from sullen resistance to what sounded like confusion. The translator stepped outside and spoke quietly to Shaw. He wants to know why we're asking about patrols. He says his unit doesn't run patrols anymore, hasn't for 2 weeks. They've been on defensive duty, manning static positions. Shaw asked if the prisoner was lying. The translator shrugged. Either lying or genuinely confused about why we think his unit should be patrolling. He seemed surprised by the question. They brought in maps and asked the prisoner to mark his unit's positions. He did so without hesitation, indicating a network of defensive positions 3 miles west of where Raymond's mathematics placed the most active patrol routes. The translator asked about other units, whether they were running the patrols instead. The prisoner said he didn't know about other units, but he'd heard rumors that command had shifted tactics after several patrols failed to return. He says his officers started talking about ghost soldiers, the translator explained. Patrols that went out and never came back. No bodies found, no contact reported. The rumor was that Australian commandos were operating behind their lines with perfect intelligence. Shaw thanked the translator and walked back to the plantation house without speaking. Kerr followed, watching Shaw's shoulders carry tension that hadn't been there before. Inside, Shaw spread out the tactical map and marked the prisoners' indicated positions. They were nowhere near the listening posts. None of Raymond's predicted patrol routes came within a mile of the defensive line the prisoner had described. Either he's feeding us disinformation, Shaw said slowly, or we've been tracking something that isn't Japanese patrols. He looked at Kerr. What else moves through jungle on a precise schedule? What else would trigger insect silence in predictable patterns? Raymond joined them and studied the map with the kind of intensity that suggested he was recalculating everything in his head. "Australian patrols," he said finally. "Our own reconnaissance teams. If they're operating on scheduled routes for coordination purposes, they'd create the same signature. Precise timing, regular intervals, predictable paths." He sat down heavily. "We've been listening to ourselves. Or partially to ourselves. Some mixture of our patrols and theirs. And we can't tell which is which, because the mathematics doesn't care about identity, only about pattern." But that didn't explain the ambush on the 19th, the one that killed 11 Japanese soldiers exactly where the predictions said they'd be. Shaw raised this point, and Raymond nodded. "Some of the data is definitely enemy movement, but how much? 20%? 50? 90? We don't know because we started with the assumption that all scheduled movement was hostile." He pulled out his charts showing the timing changes from mid-September. "Look at this again. When the patterns shifted, we assumed the enemy had changed their schedule. But what if our patrol schedules changed? What if command altered reconnaissance routes, and we've been tracking the modifications in our own doctrine?" Webb arrived with a report from Post 9 that made the situation worse. Their microphones had recorded a silence at 14:23, middle of the afternoon when neither side typically ran patrols. The listeners had tracked the silence propagation carefully. It moved west to east over 7 minutes, suggesting something large. Webb had sent a runner to investigate and received a report that made him laugh, a sound without humor. "Cassowary," Webb said. "Big one, probably male. Crossed right through the microphone array. Created a perfect silence signature that matches our patrol data within the margin of error. Raymond, how many of your predicted patrols could actually be wildlife?" Raymond didn't answer immediately. He went through his data sheets, checking duration and propagation patterns against what they knew about human movement versus animal movement. After 20 minutes, he looked up with an expression that suggested he'd found something he wished he hadn't. Quote, 117, intelligence. Shaw walked to the wall where 3 weeks of predictions were mapped in colored pencil, representing hundreds of hours of observation and analysis and mathematical modeling. Quote 118, he said. Quote 119. He turned back to the room. Quote 120. Command wanted to shut it down. The colonel from divisional headquarters returned and reviewed the prisoner interrogation, Raymond's revised analysis, and Webb's cassowary report with increasing irritation. Quote 121, he said, the words precise and cutting. Quote 122. Intelligence, Shaw argued that the system still provided value, that even probabilistic information was better than nothing. But the colonel wasn't interested in probability. He wanted certainty, actionable intelligence, not mathematical models that might be describing anything or nothing. They were given 72 hours to prove the system's validity or cease operations. Shaw called it an impossible standard. You couldn't prove validity without testing predictions, and testing predictions meant risking men on information that might be wrong. But command didn't care about the epistemological problem. They cared about results. Raymond spent the next day trying to refine his equations to filter out animal movement and friendly patrols. But the variables were too similar. Scheduled movement was scheduled movement, whether conducted by enemy soldiers, Australian reconnaissance teams, or territorial cassowaries defending their range. Kerr found Webb on the evening of October 6th, sitting outside Post 4 with a cup of tea and a cigarette, watching the jungle transition from day to night. Quote, 1, 2, 3, Kerr said. Webb nodded without looking at him. Quote, 1, 2, 4. He tapped ash from his cigarette. Quote, 1, 2, 5. The insects started their evening chorus, building from scattered clicks and whines to the full density of sound that meant the jungle was settling into night. Kerr listened with ears trained by weeks of focused observation, hearing layers he'd never noticed before he started this work. Somewhere in that sound was information. Somewhere in the silences between sounds was meaning. But extracting signal from noise required certainty about what constituted signal, and they'd lost that certainty the moment they realized they might be listening to themselves. Post 14 reported a silence at 21:47 that night, propagating north to south over 3 minutes and 20 seconds. Raymond's mathematics said it matched the profile of a patrol, 10 to 12 individuals, moving at standard infantry pace. But mathematics couldn't say whose patrol, or whether it was a patrol at all. Command wanted a decision: send an ambush team or ignore the prediction. Intelligent Shaw stared at the report for 5 minutes before making the call that Kerr knew would define everything that came after. Quote 126. The ambush team assembled at 2000 hours, 12 men from different companies, led by a lieutenant named Harrison, who'd volunteered because he wanted to see if the mathematics actually worked. Intelligent Shaw briefed them with unusual precision, showing them the predicted route, the expected timing, and the margin of error. 2237 plus or minus 90 seconds, Shaw said, pointing to a trail intersection marked on the map. If the prediction is accurate, you'll have targets. If it's not, you'll have wasted a night. Harrison asked what happened if the targets were friendly. Shaw's pause before answering told Kerr everything about how far they'd fallen into uncertainty. Challenge protocol, Shaw said finally. If you see movement, you challenge first. Standard identification procedures. Only engage if you receive hostile response or take fire. It was the right answer, the only answer that made operational sense, but it transformed the ambush into something else. A test where success meant killing the enemy, and failure might mean killing your own people, or discovering you'd set up to ambush a cassowary. Harrison accepted the orders without visible reaction, but Kerr saw something in the lieutenant's eyes that looked like contempt, directed at Shaw or Raymond, or the entire apparatus of listening posts and mathematical predictions. Kerr insisted on joining them over Shaw's objections, Kerr said. Shaw relented, probably because he knew Kerr was right. Probably because he wanted a witness he could trust when command demanded explanations. They moved out at 2100, following Harrison through terrain that had become familiar to Kerr over weeks of operations. The same trails, the same creek crossings, the same wait-a-while vines that grabbed at equipment in the dark. The ambient sound was different tonight, though. The insects seemed louder, more aggressive, as if compensating for something. They reached the ambush site at 2153 and established positions covering 60 yards of trail from 3 angles. Harrison placed Kerr behind a fallen log with a corporal from Perth who checked his rifle compulsively, working the bolt every few minutes like a nervous tick. The lieutenant synchronized watches with each position, 22:14 by Kerr's timepiece, which meant 23 minutes until the predicted contact. Kerr settled into the kind of waiting that combat requires, where every sound becomes significant and insignificant simultaneously, where your mind creates threats from shadows until you can't trust your own perception. The insects went silent at 22:34. Not the predicted time, 3 minutes early, outside Raymond's margin of error. Kerr felt the corporal next to him tense, saw Harrison in the next position raise a closed fist. Hold fire, wait for identification. The silence propagated differently than expected, not along the trail but perpendicular to it, moving from the ridge above them down toward the creek. Wrong direction, wrong timing. Everything about it felt incorrect, but something was definitely moving through the zone, because the insects wouldn't lie about that, would they? Harrison stood up, rifle ready but not raised, and called out the challenge in a voice that carried without shouting. Quote 132. The response came in English, Australian accent, Perth, or maybe Adelaide. Quote 133. Harrison swore quietly and called back the countersign. 8 men emerged from the jungle, a reconnaissance patrol, led by a sergeant who looked as surprised to see Harrison's team as they were to see him. "What are you doing here?" the sergeant asked. Harrison said they were running an interdiction operation. The sergeant laughed. "So are we. Command sent us to interdict enemy movement on this trail. Said intelligence indicated patrol activity around 22:30. Kerr felt something cold settle in his chest. 2 Australian teams, both briefed on the same prediction, both sent to ambush the same target, neither one informed that the other would be there. The kind of coordination failure that got people killed. Or, and this thought was worse, the kind of deliberate test command would run if they wanted to see whether the predictions were tracking friendly or enemy movement. Set up 2 teams based on the same intelligence. See which one reports contact. If both teams meet each other, you know the prediction was tracking friendly forces. Harrison and the sergeant compared orders by flashlight, keeping their voices low. Both teams had received briefings from different staff officers. Both described identical predictions. Neither had been told about the other's operation. The sergeant looked at Kerr. Kerr confirmed it. The sergeant shook his head. They withdrew together, both teams moving back toward friendly lines, while Kerr tried to process the implications. Raymond's mathematics had predicted a patrol at 22:37. An Australian patrol appeared at 22:34, 3 minutes early, but close enough to fall within extended margins of error. Which meant the prediction worked. It had successfully forecasted military movement with remarkable accuracy. It just happened to be forecasting their own operations rather than the enemy's. Or in addition to the enemy's. Or in some unparsable mixture of both. Intelligence Shaw received the report at 0100 and spent 10 minutes standing motionless in front of his wall of predictions. "We need to map our own patrol schedules against the recorded silences," he said finally. "Cross-reference every prediction with friendly movement orders. See how much overlap exists." Raymond started pulling duty logs and patrol reports, matching timestamps to their observation data. By dawn, they had preliminary results that confirmed what Kerr already knew. At least 40% of their predictions corresponded to documented Australian patrols. Maybe more, the data was incomplete. But that still left 60% unaccounted for. Webb pointed this out while reviewing Raymond's correlation analysis. Quote 140. He looked at the charts with an expression that suggested he was tired of questions without answers. Quote 141. Command's deadline arrived on October 8th. The colonel returned to review their findings. The prisoner interrogation, the friendly patrol encounter, Raymond's correlation analysis showing the 40-60 split. He listened without interrupting, then delivered his assessment in the kind of measured tone that presaged bad news. Quote 142, he said. Quote 143. Intelligence. Shaw tried to argue, but the colonel cut him off. Quote 144. He looked at Raymond. Quote 145. The listening posts came down over 3 days. Kerr helped dismantle post 4, coiling wire and packing microphones, while the jungle returned to being just a jungle, not a mathematical system waiting to be decoded. The cellist from Melbourne asked him if any of it had been real, if they'd actually been tracking the enemy, or if the whole operation had been an elaborate way to surveil their own forces. Kerr didn't have an answer. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe the question itself was wrong, built on assumptions about signal and noise that didn't account for how tangled everything became once you started listening carefully enough. Intelligence Shaw disappeared on October 12th. Not dramatically, not under suspicious circumstances. He simply submitted a transfer request and left for Port Moresby before anyone thought to ask him why. Raymond stayed in Aitape, reassigned to cryptographic work that kept him away from field operations. Kerr never learned what happened to the prisoner, whether he was sent to a POW camp or kept for extended interrogation. The wristwatch from Pembridge's desk remained on the ammunition crate at the now abandoned observation post, still ticking, counting time that no longer meant anything. Post 14 never stopped recording. Somebody forgot to dismantle it during the shutdown, or maybe the crew assigned to take it down decided the trek wasn't worth the effort. Either way, the microphone stayed in position, connected to a recording station nobody monitored anymore. Kerr only discovered this 3 weeks after the program ended, when he was reassigned to signals work near the coast, and happened to check a supply manifest that listed wire spools being delivered to a listening post that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. He filed it as an administrative error and forgot about it until Webb showed up at his tent on November 6th with a notebook and an expression that suggested he'd found something that shouldn't have been found. Webb had been conducting routine patrol sweeps through the old observation network, making sure the dismantled positions hadn't left equipment that could compromise other operations. At post 14, he'd discovered the recording station still running, the wire spools turning slowly, capturing data nobody would analyze. Out of curiosity, or boredom, or the same compulsion that had started this entire operation, Webb had listened to 3 nights of recordings. Quote 146, Webb said, showing Kerr the timestamps he'd logged. 22-minute intervals, then 38, then 22 again. Same rotation we were tracking in September. Whatever we were listening to, it didn't stop when we stopped listening. They didn't report it. There was no point reporting something that Command had already determined was useless intelligence. Instead, Kerr and Webb spent 2 weeks quietly monitoring Post 14's recordings, comparing the silences to Australian patrol schedules and known enemy activity indicators. The results were inconclusive in exactly the way everything about this operation had been inconclusive. Some silences corresponded to friendly patrols. Some didn't. Some matched reported enemy contacts. Most didn't. The pattern persisted regardless, mathematical and precise, describing some combination of human and animal movement that defied clean categorization. Raymond found them on November 19th, appearing at the listening post after dark without explanation for how he'd known they were there. He looked thinner, older, worn down by something more than jungle conditions. Raymond said, sitting down next to the recorder, quote, Webb asked what Raymond meant. The mathematician shrugged. Quote, they sat in silence while the recorder captured the night. At 22:07, the insects stopped calling. The three men listened to the absence, each of them hearing something different in it. Kerr heard a military patrol, friendly or enemy, moving with practiced silence. Webb heard an animal, something large enough to command respect from the smaller creatures. Raymond heard mathematics, the physical manifestation of predictable intervals and probability distributions. None of them were wrong. None of them were right. The silence lasted 93 seconds, then the insects returned, and the jungle went back to being inscrutable. Kerr received transfer orders in December, reassignment to Brisbane for signals intelligence work that had nothing to do with jungle acoustics or patrol predictions. He never learned whether Post 14 continued recording after he left, whether anyone else discovered it and tried to make sense of its data, whether the pattern eventually changed or stopped or simply outlasted everyone who'd been listening to it. Intelligence Shaw sent a single letter in January of 45, forwarded through multiple addresses before reaching Kerr in Queensland. The letter was brief. The war will end and we'll go home, and someone will ask what we learned here. Tell them we learned that listening isn't the same as understanding. Tell them we built a perfect system for describing our own ignorance. The official history of the Itape campaign mentions patrol interdiction operations in September and October of 44, crediting signals intelligence with several successful engagements. There's no mention of listening posts or insect silence patterns or mathematical predictions. Pembridge is listed as missing in action, presumed dead, circumstances unknown. The prisoner Kerr helped interrogate was eventually repatriated after the war and returned to Japan. Raymond Shaw went back to Melbourne and taught mathematics until his retirement, never publishing papers on the work he'd done in New Guinea, because the classification remained in effect, and because, Kerr suspected, Raymond had concluded there was nothing to publish, no theory to advance, just observations that raised questions without providing answers. Webb survived the war and stayed in Australia, working construction jobs in Sydney and occasionally meeting Kerr for drinks when memory or coincidence brought them together. They never talked about the listening posts. Not directly. But sometimes Webb would mention hearing something in the night. Insects going quiet. The particular quality of silence that meant something was moving nearby. And Kerr would understand they were both still listening, still trying to distinguish signal from noise, still caught in the pattern they'd discovered, without fully comprehending what it meant, or whether it had ever meant anything at all. If this story made you think about the nature of intelligence work and the limits of mathematical certainty, subscribe to the channel and support the video with a like or comment. Your engagement helps us continue exploring these lesser-known aspects of military history.